There is a small brown bottle sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. 3% hydrogen peroxide. You have walked past it 1,000 times. It cost you about $1. And the title that brought you here made a big promise that this $1 bottle can bring a dead plant back to life in a single day. So let me be honest with you, the way an old friend would before we go one step further. If a plant is truly gone, brown to the center, hollow all the way down the stem, dry as last year's kindling, there is no bottle on this earth that will raise it. Not this one. Not the $40 one either. But here is the quiet truth most of us were never taught. The plants we give up on are almost never dead. They are drowning. They are suffocating in soil that holds too much water and far too little air. They are being eaten from below by something we cannot see. And for a plant in that kind of trouble, wilting, yellowing, sliding downhill fast, this little bottle can turn the corner in about a day. I have watched it happen on my own windowsill with a plant I had already half said goodbye to. I'm glad you pulled up a chair. Welcome to Evergreen Elder Gardens, where we feed the soil, not the plant, and where we would rather hand you the honest truth than sell you another bag of something. Now, there is a reason you have never seen this little bottle dressed up and sold to you as a garden product. You cannot patent it. You cannot pour it into a fancy jug, stamp a green leaf on the label, and charge $15 for it every spring. It costs almost nothing, which, in an industry built on the next bag, is the one thing it is never quite allowed to be. Nobody buried this in a vault. The market simply had no reason to keep reminding you. Over the next little while, I'll walk you through 12 honest ways to use it, close to the way the old county extension folks might have, if peroxide had been sitting on their shelf. And somewhere near the end is the rescue I just mentioned, the one for the plant you might be ready to throw out this very week. Stay with me for that one. It may be the most useful thing you do in the garden all season. Before the recipes, let me tell you why any of this works. Because once you see it, you'll never look at that bottle the same way. Hydrogen peroxide is simply water with one extra atom of oxygen clinging on loosely. The moment it touches living tissue or wet soil, that extra atom breaks away, and for a few short minutes, you get a little burst of pure, reactive oxygen. That is the whole secret. There is no magic in it, just oxygen in the right place at the right moment. And here is the part I love. Your plants already know this molecule. When a thunderstorm rolls across the fields in spring, the lightning stirs the air in a way that leaves a trace, the tiniest amount of hydrogen peroxide, falling down with the rain. Gardeners have wondered for generations why everything looks greener after a storm than after a long week with the watering can. Part of the answer is in that trace. Now, let me be careful and honest here. The amount in rainfall is very, very small, and your bottle is far stronger, which is exactly why we always dilute it down. But the signal itself is one your seeds and roots have answered for millions of years. Plants even make their own. When a leaf comes under attack from disease, it builds hydrogen peroxide inside its own tissue, a kind of alarm bell that switches its defenses on. Soil scientists have understood this for decades, so when you mist a weak peroxide solution onto a struggling plant, you are not introducing some strange chemical it has never met. You are speaking a language it already knows by heart. So if you have poured money and worry into your garden and still watched things sulk, understand, this was never a failing in you. You were simply never told that the simplest tool was already in the house. Now, before we get our hands dirty, Everything in this video I have gathered onto a single page. Every recipe, measured out plain and simple. The short list of when to reach for the bottle, and the just as important list of when to set it down. The honest limits, all in one place. It is yours, free. No sign up, nothing to join. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can tape it right inside the shed door or above the potting bench. Then stay with me, because the very first thing on our list is something most of us get backwards before a single seed ever touches the soil. There is a particular kind of quiet disappointment we all know. You tuck seeds into warm soil, you wait, and the ground just stays bare. Most of us blame ourselves, or we blame the seeds. But often, the seeds aren't failing to wake up. They are drowning. Here is what happens, and almost nobody mentions it. When you soak seeds in a glass of plain, still water to give them a head start, the seeds drink up the oxygen in that water within hours. The water goes flat and stale, and the seeds sit there suffocating instead of sprouting. A weak peroxide soak fixes exactly that. The reason it works is twofold. That little release of oxygen keeps the water lively, and it gently softens the seed's hard coat and nudges it out of its deep sleep. Think of it as that storm signal, delivered right to the seed. Researchers at the United States Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service looked closely at this on a tough commercial seed in the laboratory, and a peroxide soak lifted germination by more than 2/3 compared to plain water. Now, that was a controlled study on one kind of seed, so your results on the kitchen counter will vary. But the principle is sound, and it costs you pennies to find out. Here is how. Mix 1 part of your 3% peroxide with 2 parts clean tap water in a glass or ceramic bowl, not metal, which can react. For most vegetable seeds, let them soak about 30 minutes. For the hard-coated old-timers like beans, peas, and morning glories, give them 2 to 4 hours. Then rinse them in plain water and plant as you always have. And the mistakes to avoid. 3 of them. Don't use a metal bowl. Don't soak far longer than you need, thinking more is better, because it isn't. And make a fresh batch each time. Yesterday's mix has already spent itself. This next one is close to my heart. Somewhere in a kitchen drawer, a lot of us have an envelope of seeds, saved from a grandmother's garden, or a variety a neighbor pressed into our hands years ago. We are half afraid to plant them, because if they don't come up, well, that's the end of them. Here is the gentle news. That date printed on a store packet is not a death date. It is closer to a sell-by date for the company. Seeds are living things, only sleeping. And the older and more tired a seed is, the more a little extra oxygen can help it find its way up. For seeds that have been stored a few years, use the same soak, 1 part peroxide to 2 parts water, but give them longer, several hours, even overnight for the really old ones. And for the most heartening sight in all of gardening, lay the rinsed seeds on a damp paper towel, fold it over, and slip it into a plastic bag somewhere warm. In a day or two, you'll see tiny white roots reaching out, proof that what looked dead was only resting. The mistake here is the simplest one of all, throwing those old envelopes away without ever trying. Don't. The signal to wake them costs less than a cup of coffee, and you might just bring a piece of someone's garden back into the light. Most heartbreak in the garden does not start with the plant. It starts with a dirty pot. Last season's troubles, fungus and bacteria, cling to the inside of an old container all winter, hiding in the dried-on crust and the little crack where the rim meets the wall. That pot can look perfectly clean and still be a hotel for the very things that topple a young seedling. Now, plenty of folks reach for bleach, and bleach does work. But it leaves fumes, it wants rinse after rinse, and it can leave behind a residue you would rather not have near tender roots. Peroxide does the job and then breaks down into nothing but water and oxygen. No fumes, no residue. You can do it right at the kitchen sink with a grandchild standing beside you. Here is how. First, scrub the pot with warm soapy water to get the visible dirt off. Then, pour or spray 3% peroxide straight from the bottle over the surface until it is dripping wet. Let it sit 10 to 20 minutes, rinse, and let it dry. The mistake to avoid is skipping that first scrub. Peroxide spends itself on caked-on dirt, so cleaning the surface first lets it do the real work on what you cannot see. The same quiet truth holds for the tools in your hand. A dirty blade carries disease straight into an open cut, passing trouble from a sick plant to a healthy one without your ever knowing it happened. So before you take cuttings or move from one plant to the next, wipe the blade. The easy way is a cotton ball dampened with 3% peroxide drawn along both sides of the blade. Or dip the cutting end of the tool in a small cup of 3% peroxide for 2 or 3 minutes, then let it dry. It takes all of 10 seconds, and it is the kind of small, steady habit that separates a garden that thrives from one that is forever fighting something. The only real mistake is forgetting to do it between plants, because that is exactly when disease likes to travel. Rooting a little cutting in a jar of water on the windowsill is one of the simplest joys there is. No digging, no bending. But that warm, still water in the sun has a habit of turning. Algae, a cloudy haze, a brown, slimy film creeping up the stem that chokes off the tender new roots before they ever take hold. A small amount of peroxide keeps that water clear and lively. As it slowly breaks down, it lifts the oxygen in the water and holds back the slime, which is exactly what a cut stem is craving while it works to grow its first roots. Add about 1 teaspoon of 3% peroxide to a quart of water in your jar. Keep the jar out of hot, direct sun, which both feeds the algae and spends the peroxide too fast. And change the water once or twice a week, even with the peroxide in it. The mistake folks make is letting that jar sit untouched for weeks, because fresh water is still the kindest thing you can give a cutting. Those 5 were about starting clean, before any trouble begins. The next 7 are a different kind. These are the ones for a plant that is already struggling, the ones we can't bear to lose, including, near the end, that rescue I promised you. Let's start with the one that breaks every seed starter's heart. Your seedlings come up green and hopeful, an inch tall, and then one morning, you find them toppled over at the soil line, pinched and fallen, as if something reached up in the night and cut them down. That is called damping off, a water mold that thrives in cool, wet, still air around young seedlings. Most of us blame bad seed. It was something invisible all along. Here is why peroxide helps. A light misting makes the very surface of the soil briefly inhospitable to those molds, so they can't get a foothold while your seedlings are at their most fragile. And here is how. Mix 1 teaspoon of 3% peroxide into 2 cups of clean water and mist the soil surface lightly just once a week while the seedlings are small. A light mist, not a soaking. And here is the honest part. Peroxide is a guard at the door, not a doctor in the ward. Once a tray has truly collapsed, the moment has passed. Clear it, clean the tray the way we just talked about, and start fresh. The companion habits matter just as much. A small fan to keep the air moving, watering from the bottom, and easing off the misting once the seedlings are up. The real mistake is leaning on the spray instead of fixing the damp, still air that let the mold in to begin with. If you keep houseplants, you know these. The tiny black flies that lift off the soil in a little cloud when you water. The flies themselves are mostly a nuisance. The real trouble is below. A single female lays a few hundred eggs in the damp top inch of soil, and the larvae quietly chew on your plant's fine root hairs. Which is why a plant can suddenly sulk and droop for no reason you can see. It is being eaten from underneath. Here is a recipe I trust because it comes from a source I trust. The cooperative extension folks at Cornell, the land-grant university many of us grew up calling for garden advice, recommend a simple drench. 1 part 3% peroxide to 4 parts water poured over the soil. You will hear it fizz as it reaches the larvae. That fizz is the work being done. How to do it right? Let the top inch of soil dry out first, since these pests breed in constant moisture, and that dry down is half the cure. Then pour the mix slowly until it just runs out the drainage holes. Wait a week, let the soil dry again, and repeat once to catch the next hatch. Set a few yellow sticky cards down at soil level to trap the adults while the drench handles the young ones below. One honest caution, and we'll come back to this at the very end. This drench reaches the good life in your soil as well as the bad, so use it for a real problem like this one, not as a weekly habit. And wait a week or so afterward before you feed the soil with anything living, like a compost tea. Give the good side time to come back. Late in a humid summer, a ghostly white dust creeps across the leaves of squash, zucchini, roses, and lilacs. That is powdery mildew, a fungus that spreads a fine web across the leaf and then casts its spores to every plant within reach. Remember what we said, that your plants make their own hydrogen peroxide to sound the alarm against disease. Well, this is where that comes home. A weak peroxide spray doesn't fight against the plant. It backs up a defense the plant already understands. Here is the spray, and notice, it is far weaker than anything we ever pour on soil. Just 1 teaspoon of 3% peroxide to a full gallon of water. Spray both the tops and the undersides of the affected leaves, because that web likes to hide underneath too. And here is the how-to that actually saves your plant. Spray early in the morning or in the evening, never in the hot midday sun. Wet leaves, peroxide, and harsh sun all together will scorch the very leaves you are trying to save. 2 honest notes. Always test 1 leaf first and wait an hour. Tender plants like ferns and prayer plants want it weaker still. And if the mildew is heavy, pull off the worst leaves as you spray to lighten the load. But the mistake to avoid above all the others? Never reach for a stronger mix, hoping for a faster result. With peroxide, stronger is not better. Stronger is sunburn. And here we are, the rescue I promised you. The plant most folks throw out the week before it would have turned around. Root rot fools us. The plant wilts and yellows, so we do the loving thing. We water it more. And the wilting only gets worse. Because the trouble was never thirst. Down below, the roots are drowning in airless, soggy soil, going brown and soft. So let me say it plainly, the way an old friend should. More houseplants are lost to too much water than to too little. We don't kill them by neglect. We kill them with kindness. Before you spend an ounce of effort, do this 30-second test. Pick a stem and scratch the surface with your fingernail. If it is green and moist just under the skin, the plant is alive and worth saving. If it is brown, dry, and hollow, work your way down until you find green. The same goes for the roots. Firm and pale, you keep. Brown and slimy, you trim clean away. Now the rescue itself. Slide the plant gently from its pot and rinse the roots under cool, running water. With a clean blade, trim away every soft brown root, keeping only the firm, pale ones. Mix 1 part 3% peroxide with 2 parts water and soak just those remaining roots. A quick dip if only a root or two was lost. 10 to 20 minutes for a moderate case. The peroxide knocks back the rot on the roots and floods the suffocating tissue with oxygen, both at once. Then repot into fresh, dry soil in a clean pot with open drainage holes. Move it to bright shade, no direct sun while it heals, and water only when the top inch or two has gone fully dry. And here is the honest heart of it. In the first week, you may see nothing at all. By the second or third, the sliding stops. By the fourth, a single new leaf. And that, right there, is the whole story. This $1 bottle bought your plant time and knocked back the rot. But the only lasting cure is a gentler hand at the watering can. Save it today, then change the habit that drowned it, and you won't find yourself back here next month. Not every struggling plant has rot yet. Some are simply gasping. The soil has gone dense and soggy. The air spaces are full of water instead of air, and the roots can't breathe, though nothing is infected yet. The leaves droop, the pot feels heavy as a stone, and you would swear you had done everything right. A light drench gives those roots a breath while the soil dries out. Mix 1 tablespoon of 3% peroxide into 1 cup of water. Gentler than the rot rescue because this plant isn't badly hurt yet. Pour it over the soil, let it drain, and then let the soil dry to the touch an inch or two down before you water it again. But be honest with yourself here. This buys time. It does not fix a pot with no drainage holes or a soil too heavy for the plant. Peroxide gives you the window to repot. It does not do the repotting for you. The mistake is treating the gasping again and again instead of fixing whatever is holding all that water. You will be surprised how often that sad pot on the windowsill was only gasping and not dying at all. More and more of us are growing a little something in water now. A jar of herbs, a small lettuce set up on the counter. And still, water with little oxygen is a breeding ground for the very same slime and rot we have been talking about. A small dose of peroxide keeps that water clear and the oxygen up. The same simple principle growers have leaned on in their water gardens for years. As it breaks down, it adds oxygen right where the roots are reaching, and it holds back the brown film on the glass. Start light. About 1 to 3 teaspoons of 3% peroxide to a gallon of water, beginning at the low end and watching how the roots respond. 2 honest cautions. The margin between helpful and too much is narrower in water than it is in soil, so go light and mean it. If you ever see the roots browning, ease off right away. And if you keep fish in the same water, the way some folks do, peroxide will harm the helpful bacteria your system depends on. So that is a different setup, and it needs different care. The mistake is pouring with a heavy hand. In water, less truly is more. And one last one. A small, kind thing for the flowers you cut from your own garden to bring inside. In a vase, bacteria build up in the water and slowly clog the stems, so the blooms can no longer draw up a drink, and they fade before their time. A mild splash of peroxide holds that bacteria back and keeps the water fresh. Just half a tablespoon of 3% peroxide to a cup of vase water. That is all there is to it. The mistake is letting the vase water go cloudy and warm, because a fresh, clean drink lets you enjoy the fruits of your work a few good days longer. And now the most important thing I will say today. If you remember nothing else, remember this. A cheap bottle of something that fizzes and works can make a gardener feel a little too bold. You see the mildew vanish, you see the gnats gone, and you start to think, maybe I should pour this on everything, every single week. Please don't. And here is the quiet reason why. Hydrogen peroxide does not know the difference between friend and foe. When you drench your soil, you knock back the rot and the pests, but you also harm the good life down there, the helpful bacteria and the fine fungal threads that wrap around your plant's roots and help it drink and feed. A single teaspoon of healthy soil holds a living web of those threads longer than you would ever guess. That web is the real garden, the part you never see. So every heavy drench is a kind of reset of that whole underground world. This is not a reason to fear the bottle. It is a reason to use it like a careful gardener. Only when there is a real problem to solve, only at the gentle dose, and never as a weekly routine. And after any drench, wait a week or so before you feed the soil with anything living, compost, worm castings, a compost tea, and let that good web come back. There are also troubles peroxide simply cannot touch, and knowing them will save you real heartache. It cannot cure a virus. Twisted, mottled new growth means it is time to gently remove that plant and start over. It will not feed a hungry plant. Pale, even yellowing means the soil needs feeding, not oxygen. And it cannot give a root-bound plant more room. That one just needs a bigger pot. And for your own safety, 3 simple rules. Always stay with the 3% bottle from the pharmacy shelf. The strong industrial kind can burn skin and eyes, and it has no place in a home garden. Never mix peroxide with bleach or with vinegar. Those make fumes you do not ever want in your lungs. And when in doubt, dilute it down and test it on a single leaf first. That restraint, knowing when to set the bottle down, is the very thing that makes the other 12 work the way they are meant to. Because we were never really trying to win a war against our soil, we were only ever trying to tend it. The plant I told you about at the very start, the one I had already half said goodbye to, it was a geranium. It sat on my grandmother's windowsill first, and then on mine. I poured everything the catalogs told me to into that little pot, season after season, and watched it struggle. It took me far too long to understand what she had known all along. She was never really feeding the plant. She was tending the few inches of living soil beneath it, that quiet, unseen world her own mother had taught her to care for. The dollar bottle has its place on that windowsill, and a good one. But it was always the smaller part of the story. The soil was the rest. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. I'll see you out by the beds.